It might seem almost paradoxical to consider the concept of legacy in the never ending universes of Marvel and DC. But the truth is, there have been many times when the mantle of a costume character, both hero and villain, have been handed off to a different person. The reasons vary: changing times, story based factors, external meddling. Anyway, let's see what it means to be a part of a legacy in the Big Two. Since there are several ways to define legacy, I feel it might be best to define what I mean by a legacy character before going forward. As per my definition, a legacy character takes on the name of a previously established character due to the previous bearer of the name not using the mantle at the time. For example, Kyle Rayner is a legacy character to Hal Jordan since Hal was not using the name then, while Guy Gardner or John Stewart are not, as Hal was still Green Lantern at the time. Also, to use another Green Lantern example, Hal Jordan is not a legacy character to Alan Scott, the Golden Age Green Lantern, as he was a reimagining of the concept of the Green Lantern. Even after Crisis on Infinite Earths, this holds as Alan doesn't have a direct connection to Hal. While there may be outliers, this is broad enough to cover most legacy characters. So let's start with seeing how the world outside your window handled passing the torch to someone new. Early on, Marvel didn't have too many legacy characters outside of Hank Pym, who, by this point, has a legacy for one of his many alter egos, and Ghost Rider, who has had several different characters take on the mantle for decent amounts of time. No, Marvel generally would approach the concept of legacy in a rather interesting fashion. The most significant example of this was Iron Man. In Iron Man issue 169, as a result of his struggles with alcoholism, Tony Stark was unable to put on the Iron Man armor to face off against a villain who was coming to Stark International. This leads Jim Rhodes, a longtime supporting character, to put on the armor to face the threat. Tony decides to hand off the mantle to Rhodey, who would remain Iron Man for about 2 years, after which Stark would return to being Iron Man, in issue 200 no less, and Rhodey would get his own armor and mantle, War Machine. This was an interesting way to handle it, and Rhodey got to take part in some key events in Marvel history as Iron Man, like taking part in Secret Wars and being a founding member of the West Coast Avengers. The problem started when Marvel continued to do this multiple times, with returns diminishing with each time they did it. We got Eric Masterson as Thor for a while, who would later become Thunderstrike, and John Walker as Captain America, who would later become US Agent. Neither would have anywhere close to the impact that Rhodey as Iron Man had, with Eric dying at the end of his solo series and John only occasionally popping up when someone remembers he exists. Though, we would get a better version of Captain America much later when Steve died after Civil War and Bucky would become Captain America for a while. But now, let's take a moment to address how the distinguished competition handle legacy. DC Comics is known for its great legacy characters, and that reputation didn't come out of thin air. This is because when DC passed on a legacy, most tended to stick. The most well-known example was when Wally took on the mantle of the Flash after Crisis on Infinite Earths and would define the Flash title for over 20 years. The late 90s and early 2000s would be defined by legacy, as several titles would feature a different character taking on an established role. Green Lantern, Green Arrow, Hourman, Chronos, Robin, and Fate, Batgirl, Ray. There was a clear attempt to do something new here, but the most notable of these was Starman, which can be summarized as James Robinson taking a Golden Age character, who could be charitably called C-list at best, and using him to weave a tale of legacy spanning from World War II to the 853rd century, encompassing all who had used the name, even the ones seemingly not directly related. When people mention DC and Legacy in the same breath, this is the comic they most likely think of. Redundancy. That's pretty much the only problem with legacy characters in comics. What happens when you introduce a new character under an established mantle and then take it away from them? They are left rudderless and directionless, making the universe seem bloated. Sure, you might give them a new role, but it won't be long before another new character is introduced, and there are only so many roles to be fulfilled. Due to being never-ending universes, both DC and Marvel have reached a point where not only have their approaches to legacy been done to death, but they have also ended up copying each other's methods, albeit poorly. For instance, at DC, most of those legacy characters I mentioned would get pushed to the background when certain people working at the publisher brought back their older counterparts, and the legacies would still have the same name most of the time. On the other hand, Marvel would have multiple characters like Captain America and Thor get legacy characters, while the original name bearers were still around, even if they weren't using the name at the time, ensuring that the audience knew that the change was most likely temporary. The result? You have multiple characters with the same name running around. While I'll probably make a separate video about name sharing in comics and when it works and when it doesn't, the main issue circles back to redundancy. And let's just say there's always a main version of the character, and if you have trouble telling, it's the one whose story is being told in the main title. Legacy is a great thing to explore as someone taking on the mantle of an established character with all the responsibilities and pressures that come with it, and seeing how they cope with it makes for a great story. The problem is, in universes where everything feels temporary, it can be hard to be excited when someone takes on the legacy of a character when it will most likely return to the previous bearer at some point. But hey, at least we hopefully enjoy the journey, even if we know the destination.